King Charles III addresses the British Parliament for the first time as monarch. We begin today's show looking at the legacy of British colonialism in the Caribbean, where there are growing calls for reparations. The Caribbean at one point formed the heart of England's first colonial empire in North America. Many of the more than 2.5 million enslaved Africans taken to the British Caribbean were worked to death. The string of island nations includes Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, and Trinidad and Tobago, among many others now in the British Commonwealth. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the Prime Minister of the twin island nation Antigua and Barbuda said voters may soon decide whether to leave the Commonwealth and become a republic. Prime Minister Gaston Browne spoke to ITV News after he confirmed Charles III as king and head of state.
This is not an act of hostility or any difference between Antigua and Barbuda and the monarchy, but it is the final step, as I said before, to complete that circle of independence, to ensure that we are truly a sovereign nation.
What sort of time frame would you think on a referendum then?
So I'd say within the next probably 3 years.
This comes after Barbados voted last year to break from its colonial past and become a republic. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, the ruling Labour Party says it also plans to hold a referendum on becoming a republic. For more, we're joined in Kingston, Jamaica, by the renowned Jamaican dub poet Muta Baruka, who's also a musician, radio show host as well. And in St. John's, Antigua, Dorbreen Omar is with us, the chairperson of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Commission, also an ambassador at large of Antigua. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Dorbreen Omar, let's begin with you. With the death of the Queen, first your response, and then what you're calling for your country.
Well, it's good to be here. Let me say thanks for having me. In terms of my response, I will be very measured here. I will recognize that we are talking about death. We are talking about the loss of human life, and that the Queen would have had family, etc. But I'm under no obligation, I think, to be mourning her death. And that is simply because of, I think, my understanding of history, my understanding of the relationships of the British monarchy to African people and Asian people, but to African people certainly on the continent and here in the Caribbean. And so that my response is perhaps to recognize the role that the Queen Elizabeth II has played, how she has managed to cloak the historical brutality of empire in this this veneer of grandeur and pomp and pageantry, I guess, graciousness. But I think that at this point in time, we need to examine that history a lot more closely.
And speaking of that history, could you, for those people who are not aware, especially of the roles of King Charles I and King Charles II in the Caribbean, and especially towards your country, could you talk about that?
Well, if we look at the role of monarchy, so we are going back now, mid-17th century, 1600s. King Charles I was perhaps the monarch, I think, that opened the trade between Britain and Africa. That was originally gold, minerals, etc., that opened that trade up to human trafficking, to the enslavement, to the movement of enslaved Africans. King Charles II, who followed him, actually was responsible, along with his then cousin, who later became James I, totally responsible for and ownership of the Royal African Company that moved more Africans off of the continent into the Americas than any other company in history. So what we're talking about here is the involvement of British monarchy in the ownership and the operation of the transatlantic, I prefer to call it, of the European slave trade, the movement of Africans here into the Caribbean. And so we now see this movement, and even before Charles I, we can be addressing Elizabeth I. And we see this recurrence, of course, in the names that we're talking about. And so we now supposedly should be mourning the death of Elizabeth II and welcoming a Charles III. But we know them. We know these Charleses and we know these Elizabeths. So there's virtually no mourning for me at this moment.
I'd also like to bring in Mutabaruka, the renowned Jamaican poet, musician. Your response to the death of Queen Elizabeth and also of the British Empire's relationship to Jamaica.
Well, good morning. I am totally in agreement with the first speaker. And I don't even want to go back into slavery because a lot of people claim that Queen Elizabeth was not responsible for what her ancestors did. She herself said that slavery was legal at the time, so she don't really recognize what we in the Caribbean is talking about. Now, we have to realize in 1952, that was when she ascended the throne of England. And if you check the history between 1952 and now, you will see that even though slavery was abolished, but they, what we call it, redefined slavery and call it colonialism. And colonialism in this part of the world was represented by the throne of England. So we're not really talking now about an individual person. We're talking about a corporation, an institution, which is called the Monarchy of England, that has totally devastated a lot of the progress we could have made if it wasn't for this what we call colonialism, interpreted to us as slavery still. Now, we have to remember, in her time, there was the Mama uprising, which is a very interesting case because she was actually named Queen of England when she was in Kenya. And the cruel and wicked things that the British Army did to the African people there cannot be seen as just, okay, that is just something. And she had never granted any sympathy or say anything that would say, well, you know, she have a kind of art to what was taking place. We look in South Africa during the apartheid system. The British is part of that wicked apartheid regime that devastated and killed thousands of Africans who was fighting for right to be a person in South Africa. And it was recently, even during the time of Mandela and Winnie Mandela, that we was told that they were still on the list of terrorist groups. And even though England and this queen was ruling at that time, there was no effort to find out what is it they can do to alleviate the problems that confront African people in this part of the world. Now we come to the Caribbean in this time. The Caribbean has been devastated. We know in history, one of the richest plantation owners, cane owners, was a man by the name of William Beckford. William Beckford got his riches and became one of the richest men in England in that time. And up to this day, when we recognize how much people died because of the institutionalized slavery that they call colonialism, up to this day, the movement of our people, especially in Jamaica now, where our constitution was given to us by England through the hands of the so-called Bustamante and Norman Manley, who was recognized during that time in 1962 when Jamaica was supposed to be getting independent. They went to England and they got a constitution that is now part and parcel of what Jamaicans are supposed to live by. And when we look at that constitution, it does not include ownership of land in Jamaica by the people. If you go into the courts of Jamaica, it says the Crown versus Tom Stroke, or the Crown versus John Tom. That is what we have to face right now. Now, when you recognize that Jamaica is supposed to be an independent country, most Jamaicans say Jamaica is not independent. that even though people say it's like it's not really, she's not really governing the country, but the head of state is the Governor General representing the Queen of England in an independent country. How the hell that is possible? That you have an independent country that is the first lady is the Governor General's wife, not the Prime Minister's wife. And they set and designed the Constitution that way. And these so-called, we call them bossy slaves, jacket and tie slaves, that they continue to uphold and maintain that regime that has committed so much atrocities and crimes in this century, in this time. They have been committing it and still committing it. And we don't see why we should now sit down and say 12 day mourning. That will show how backward and how what we call the Stockholm Syndrome has grabbed our leaders in the Caribbean. That here's a family that represent criminal activities for your ancestors. And now you start to love them. How is that possible? How is that possible that we who know the history is keep repeating the history? We know what is taking place in this democratic, so-called democratic country that is still honoring the most gruesome and cruel monarchy that ever exists. And we know of it. How can we now sit and say, we have 12 days of mourning? 12 days of mourning for what? What we're mourning that for? Why we're not mourning for the thousands and millions of people that died across the Atlantic Ocean? We're not mourning for all the warriors of our time. There's no day for Taki, there's no day for Nani. All of these people who died because they stand up and struggle to get out of the class of British colonialism. We now sit and say, we must mourn. I am not one of them who's mourning, and I can talk for a lot of Rastafari, Bridget and Sitchin.
In Kingston, Jamaica for us. And talking to folks on the ground there. Kerry, there was a survey back in August that actually found 56% of Jamaicans support removing the British monarch. And that was, by the way, before the Queen died. And they're also asking for reparations for the atrocities of slavery. As you talk to folks on the ground there in Jamaica after the death of the Queen, what are you hearing?
Well, you know, it's very much the local history here in the West Indies, and specifically here in Jamaica. The folks who live here, majority of them are descendants of slaves, and they were brought here by the Royal African Company, which was directly in line with the monarchy that succeeds today in King Philip III. Or King Charles III. And so what you have is a lineage that many here say means that those who are in authority now should apologize and should recognize that the money that was taken off of the backs of slaves here from the sugar plantations is money that not only added to the wealth of the monarchy, but over the centuries compounded, making them even wealthier. So joining us here is somebody who can talk directly to that. Introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Muta Baruka.
Muta Baruka, and I'm curious, first of all, how do you feel about the Queen's death?
I don't have no feelings about it, you know.
No feelings at all?
No.
Even though this is a Commonwealth nation and she was the head of state?
She's the head of state of the Commonwealth nation. I am not part of the Commonwealth. I don't recognize myself as part of the Commonwealth nation, even though I'm in a Commonwealth nation. See, I'm a Rastafarian. The only king I recognize is Emperor Haile Selassie I.
So let's explain a little bit about that. You are a descendant of the families that were enslaved and brought from ships. Do you know where your family descendants came from?
Very difficult to say, but given what we know about Jamaica, we would say from the West Coast, which is like Ghana, Nigeria. Most of us is from Ghana. Because we know about the Accra compound, and we know about the Coromantee. These are some African nations that came out and came across the ship.
So when you look at the moment that we're in, after 70 years, no apology from the Queen for the enslavement, and now a new king, what is your expectation, first of all, in terms of an apology? Are you expecting one?
Look here, the Queen has been there for 70 years, and she has been all over the world, one of the most traveled monarch of England. And there's so much atrocity that was happening in India, in Kenya, in Southern Africa, and in the Caribbean. And she has not even recognized that her family was responsible for what is taking place, especially now what is taking place in Jamaica, because all they did was to rebrand slavery and call it colonialism. So it's the same thing.
So now we go forward as opposed to looking back.
Yes.
What is your expectation?
Yeah, all right. My expectation is that we have to continue the struggle to make whosoever is on the throne now recognize that there's something that is need to be done right now, and that is an apology and reparation.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
You know, calculating reparations, Yasmin, is very complicated because some would say that in the 1800s, when the slave owners were actually compensated to the tune of 20 million pounds, that why did the slaves get any of that money? And if that were the case, then maybe the money that has since, you know, think about inflation, you think about how money could have been invested in compounding, that we're talking perhaps billions, and some people have even calculated trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
Yasmin?
Carrie Sanders for us. That was a really good conversation, Carrie, and it helps me as we kind of shape the future of what is to come with King Charles now in place and the uphill battle he has ahead of him.